Since the beginning of the week, attention is focused on the aftermath of the Nova Kakhovka Dam collapse. However, it did not go unnoticed that the Ukrainian forces accelerated their activities along the front line southeast of the city of Zaporizhia. Last day, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu stated that the Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade made 4 attempts to cross Russian lines with up to 1,500 soldiers and 150 armored vehicles. Shoigu claims that the attacks were repelled and that the Ukrainian forces suffered significant losses in terms of both soldiers and weapons. The Ministry of Defense in Moscow released a drone video that allegedly showed a series of attacks on Ukrainian tanks during the same conflict. In response, Russian military blogger Semyon Prigov reported that Ukrainian armed forces were making progress south of Yuriev towards South Korea. Orekov is the town of Tokmak in the Russian-controlled region. Baikov said that the situation facing the Russian forces is very serious. Attention has been focused on this part of the front line for months. It is therefore no surprise that activity in Ukraine has increased, destroying Russia's land bridge to Crimea by pushing back Russian forces into the Sea of Azov is clearly a central military goal for Ukraine. Tokmak is located on the road to Melitopol, one of the 3 major cities under Russian control very close to the coast. The Ukrainian officials have said little about how things are going. President Vladimir Zelensky in his speech last night described the situation as very tough wars. The difficult conflicts between Russia and Ukraine ended against Moscow army. The Ukrainian Air Force has launched 19 attacks on Russian manpower clusters and 5 attacks targeting Russian anti-aircraft missile systems in the past 24 hours. As a result of the attacks, the armed forces of Ukraine eliminated 800 Russian soldiers on the front lines in the past day alone. About 211,150 Russian soldiers died in Ukraine. The days are quite active on the Eastern Front as well as the southern axis of Ukraine. Defense offensive operation continues in the Donetsk region. Ukrainian defense forces are successful not only on the flanks around Bakhmut, but also in other parts of the front. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky praised his troops for alleged advances near the devastated city of Bakhmut, while Russia claimed it had repelled a large-scale offensive. The counter-claims came as Pope Francis's peace envoy, Italian Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, arrived in Kiev for 2 days of talks. Previously, Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine Heinmeier had made some achievements on the battlefield. Heinmeier stated that the Bakhmut region continues to be the epicenter of conflicts. Mali R stated that they are advancing on a very broad front there. In addition, a senior Russian war correspondent, Alexander Kotes, noted that the battles continued around Volodar in the south of the Donetsk region and further north in Soledar and Bakhmut, which were occupied by Moscow forces after months of fighting. Kotes reported that Ukrainian forces were conducting offensive operations in and around Bakhmut, but suggested that Kiev had not yet brought the main forces into battle. Also, Prigozhin announced that Ukrainian troops had made gains near Bakhmut. Wagner Group leaders said that the Russian troops were gradually leaving the village of Bykhovka near Bakhmut, and that it was a disgrace after the situation in and around Bakhmut. Mariinka remains the #2 hotspot. It was once again confirmed that the Russian troops will continue to focus their main efforts on attempts to completely occupy the Luhansk region. More than 40 clashes took place in the operational zone of the defense forces in the direction of Tavria the other day. Russian troops continue their offensive operations in the direction of Andriivka. On the other hand, the 4-day Ukrainian offensive near Bakhmut and western Zaporizhia. The new offensive action near the border of Zaporizhia and Donetsk regions indicates the beginning of a new phase of the counterattack. After weeks of forming activities before a counter-offensive, offensive attacks took place by the Ukrainian military forces around Bakhmut and the next region southwest of Orikhiv in the western Zaporizhia region and around Velika Novosilka, near the border of Zaporizhia and Donetsk. according to Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hainwayer and Ukraine's official spokesperson, Sarai Sharavathi. Since Sunday, June 4th, Ukrainian troops have been hitting Russian positions on the southern and northern flanks of Bakhmut. Ukrainian Eastern military forces advanced up to 1,600 meters. According to the Institute for War Studies, since Sunday, June 4th, Ukrainian troops have conducted operations against Russian positions in the occupied western Zaporizhia region, including those 15 kilometers southwest of the city of Orikhiv. In its daily campaign update is reported that Ukrainian forces launched a limited but still significant offensive in the western Upper Tu region on the night of June 7th and 8th. The is reported that Russian sources began reporting late at night on 7th of June that elements of the Ukrainian brigades equipped with Western equipment launched an offensive with Robertson to the southwest of Orikhiv in the western average region with the aim of breaking through the Russian defensive line. Geolocatian images indicated that Ukrainian forces most likely passed the first line of defense in this area. According to the CW, however, geolocatian images show that the Russian elements succeeded in the counterattack and eventually pushed the Ukrainian forces back to their original positions. The Russian military information platform reported that significant ground attacks are ongoing in Ukraine. Senior Ukrainian officials confirmed the fact of the war, but denied that the last day's clash was the main offensive. In another development, the collapse of the Nova Kakhovka Dam on the Dnipro River in southern Ukraine virtually ends all hope that Kiev troops can launch a successful offensive on the waterway. According to an advisor from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the collapse of the dam, which occurred after a series of eruptions reported on Monday night, caused severe flooding in the lower Dnipro River basin. Currently, hundreds of thousands of people in the region are being evacuated. The river forms part of the front line between Ukraine and Russian forces. The Kherson part of the front line became one of the possible sites for the long-awaited spring-summer counter-offensive of Ukraine. Andrei Zagorodnik, an advisor to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, expressed that an amphibious attack along the Dnipro is now unlikely. Andrei Zagorodnik claimed that Moscow would not take responsibility for the disaster, saying that the collapse was pure terror. Zagorodnik said that blowing up the dam is to divert attention from the counterattack and prevent Ukrainian forces from crossing the Dnipro. Kiev blamed Russian troops for the disaster when President Vladimir Zelensky branded Russian forces as terrorists. Ukraine had previously warned that Russian troops mined the dam, preparing it for destruction if Ukraine advanced further. So how do armies turn water into a weapon of war? Barriers and dams are some of the oldest pieces of infrastructure known to human civilization, and warfare is perhaps humanity's oldest social activity. We have many examples of states destroying the infrastructure that traps or channels water in order to win military victories. Indeed, in some cases, the militarization of water infrastructure has been critical to nations' survival strategies. For example, the most important use of water as a weapon in the history of modern warfare came in June 1938, when China's nationalist government crossed the Yellow River embankments to slow the advance of the Imperial Japanese Army during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Weirs were the heart of a water management system at the absolute core of 2,500 years of Chinese civilization. As a result, we do not yet know who crossed the Kakhovka Dam. We do not know how the crossing of the dam will affect the course of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the next few weeks. More evidence may emerge that clearly defines a clear group of perpetrators and the decision-making process behind the violation. But it should come as no surprise that the water infrastructure at the very center of human civilization has become a part of this war. The damage to this dam is the latest indication that Russia and Ukraine are waging an almost all-out war for the future of the region. Tensions on the front lines in Ukraine had dropped considerably for about a few months. Both sides of the war had greatly reduced offensive operations, but a few days ago, Bakhmut, the center of the clashes, was active again. After a long break, the Ukrainian armed forces signed a historic step in Bakhmut. Russia's defense ministry said yesterday that it faced Ukrainian attacks on a 102-kilometer section of the front near the besieged city of Bakhmut. The Russian Ministry of Defense said today that up to 40 tanks and more than 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers were launched into offensive operations in the direction of Solder in the Donetsk region. Ukraine announced gains in Bakhmut after Russia denied it. Ukraine's military of defense has claimed it has regained ground in Bakhmut, a rare advance after months of crushing Russian gains in Bakhmut. In this regard, the Kiev authorities announced that the Ukrainian forces had advanced 2 kilometers around Bakhmut in just 1 week as a result of the striking offensive operation. It was the 1st Assault Battalion of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, the Special Forces unit that led the attack. According to the commander of this battalion, the territorial gains of Kiev took place near the Seversky Donetsk Canal between the villages of Ivanivka and Kurdyumov. The Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister, Anna Malia, confirmed these statements in a post on Telegram. Anna Malyar announced that Russia suffered significant troop losses as Ukraine gained 2 kilometers without losing any position. She said geolocated images show successful operations by Kiev forces in the west and southwest of the town of Donetsk near Kromov and Belahora. Ukrainian sources said his forces destroyed the 6th and 8th companies of the 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade of the Russian 3rd Army Corps near Bakhmut and advanced 1.6 miles along a 1.9-mile front line. Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade posted a video on social media that allegedly showed the conflict with Russia's 72nd Brigade. Andriy Beletsky, the founder of Ukraine's Azov Regiment, said that the 6th and 8th divisions of the Russian brigade were completely destroyed. The Ukraine 3rd Assault Brigade was formed from the Azov Regiment at the end of 2022. In other words, the 3rd Taras Brigade of Ukraine is the Azov Regiment, which consists entirely of elite fighters. Kraken, one of the strongest troops of the Azov Regiment, led the Ukrainian counterattack. Statements from Ukrainian officials signaled a change in momentum in Bakhmut. Meanwhile, the Russian Defense Ministry stated that the Ukrainian forces accelerated their attacks in the north of the region. On the other hand, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky reported that he met with senior military commanders and that General Oleksandr Syrsky's forces stopped the Russians and even repulsed the Russian troops in some directions. In his nightly speech to the Ukrainian people, Zelensky praised his troops and noted the low morale of the Russian forces. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the millionaire owner of Wagner, Russia's private military contractor who often criticizes the Russian army, once again drew attention by losing ground around Bakhmut and revealing his forces fighting for the city. In a video statement on the subject, Prigozhin mocked the report of the Russian Ministry of Defense, which claimed that his forces were regrouping to take more favorable positions, noting that the Russian troops had effectively fled. In fact, the Ukrainian forces carried out actions that confirm their statements with a historical offensive operations they carried out in Bakhmut in the past few days. The likelihood of this being true had already increased after Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin's bluff against Russian President Putin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, because Prigozhin had announced that he would withdraw his mercenaries from Bakhmut for additional military ammunition and supplies. The Wagner leader shared a striking video where he made almost insulting remarks to Putin and Shoigu. As a result, Putin and Shoigu provided the Wagner forces with the support they wanted, so the Wagner boss continued to hold his troops in Bakhmut. However, this chaos between the Russian administration and Prigozhin gave the Ukrainian army an incredible advantage. The Ukrainian armed forces had a serious preparation period in Bakhmut and its environs, thanks to the hesitation caused by Prigozhin. And finally, the expected offensive of the Ukrainian forces took place. Melitopol exiled Mayor Ivan von Fedorov reported a massive explosion southeast of Bakhmut. While it is not known what caused the explosion, it turned out that the Ukrainian Air Force carried out 14 attacks on Russian troops and Russian military equipment in this area. Alongside the airstrikes, Ukrainian forces claimed to have destroyed 9 Russian UAVs. The Ukrainian armed forces also announced that it has successfully launched attacks on dozens of Russian military targets southeast of Bakhmut, including artillery, ammunition depots, and air defense equipment. After months of stalemate, the Ukrainian counterattack, aided by newly arrived Western weapons, had a cold shower in the Kremlin. Some Russian military bloggers made statements confirming the offensive of the Ukrainian forces. Pro-Kremlin Russian war correspondent Sasha Katz stated that the Ukrainian counterattack has begun and that there's been remarkable activity on other front lines as well as in Bakhmut. Sasha Katz, citing reliable sources, suggested that Ukrainian tanks were advancing on the Kharkiv road toward the Russian border. Katz added that there are low loaders on the columns carrying the Western tank models used by the Ukrainian forces. In other words, Kiev had decided to aggravate the situation on the northern front in parallel with the start of offensive actions on the flanks of Bakhmut. Alexander Simonov, another Russian war correspondent, wrote in Telegram that Ukrainian forces had captured several square kilometers near the village of Bodanivka, near Bakhmut. Based on all these statements, the Ukrainian armed forces was both conducting a striking offensive operation in Bakhmut and trying to keep the borderlines from the northern side of the country away from Russian troops. Of course, there are important contributors to the launch of an effective offensive by the Ukrainian forces on such a large scale. These are Western and U.S. military aid. According to international intelligence reports, close to 100% of Western and U.S. military aid has already reached Ukraine. In fact, an unnamed senior military official who drew attention to Western and U.S. aid made critical statements about the situations in both Bakhmut and other front lines of Ukraine. A senior U.S. military official reported that Ukrainian forces gained a great advantage by hitting targets such as Russian army arsenals, command centers, armor and artillery systems in Bakhmut, based on the statements of so many high-ranking military and political officials. How did the most important person evaluate the successful offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut and other front lines? Former Russian commander Igor Girkin said in a statement that Russian President Vladimir Putin does not have any goals or strategies in the Ukraine war. Rising military losses on the battlefield have made Putin the subject of criticism among Russian nationalists who often support the idea of taking Ukrainian territory but question the effectiveness of Moscow's military leadership. Igor Girkin was one of the people who had the most ardent statements on the subject. Girkin, who came to the fore during the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and was convicted of participating in the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 last year, is one of the leading voices among Russian nationalists. For this reason, Girkin's statements on the subject are of great importance, stressing that Putin cannot have a war strategy if he's not clear about his goals. Girkin explained that this is one of the reasons why Ukraine achieved the last victories. In a separate post, Igor Girkin reported that he believed that Russia would be defeated soon as the Russian army did not manage to defeat Ukraine in any way during the winter-spring campaign. Girkin's words came as the battle for control of Bakhmut continued as the Wagner Group reversed course in their plan to leave the city, which had witnessed some of the most intense clashes of the entire war. Ukrainian Commander General Oleksandr Skirsky confirmed these statements of Igor Girkin. Oleksandr Skirsky stated that the Ukrainian forces repelled Russian troops in multiple attempts to attack the city. So what kind of response is expected from the Russian side against these successful steps of the Ukrainian armed forces? According to the Kiev intelligence chief, Russia does not have the ability to make another attempt at a serious attack anywhere in Ukraine. Major General Kyrylo Budanov, head of Ukraine's main intelligence agency, stated that as of today, Russia does not have the military, economic, or political potential to create another attack attempt. Budanov claimed that Russia's missile stocks were declining, but the Ukrainian intelligence chief added that Moscow is still fully capable of conducting serious defensive operations. Actually, Budanov was right about this. The Russians are trying to accumulate certain stocks and keep them ready in order to thwart the offensive. But the reality, according to most intelligence reports, is that the Russians have reduced their stockpiles to almost zero in the coming hours. The Russians rapidly changed their axis of advance and tried to catch the Ukrainians by surprise with a sudden attack from the west. They prepared a powerful fist consisting of several tank companies, but unfortunately for the Russians, this resulted in devastating losses and a huge scandal with demands to fire all commanders involved in planning this operation. Here, the Russians canceled their assaults in the direction of coal mines and Boulder itself and started moving around this town. The primary goal of the Russians here is to cut supplies from Bahia Blanca, and they can achieve it either by attacking it directly or by penetrating the territory in between. Their secondary goal is to lengthen the front line and force the Ukrainians to stretch their forces along the Bulge, which should also undermine the ability of the Ukrainians to reinforce Volodar. This is a very questionable decision because the Ukrainians can deliver supplies through Vodny. Nonetheless, as reported by the Ukrainian General Staff, the Russians started moving in the direction of Bahia Blanca and Pachuca. The local geography is also not on the side of the Russians, as they are once again attacking from the lowlands. It looks like the Russians took control in the area in front of Shevchenko, got across the river and launched a powerful attack in an attempt to take the local hills. Even at first glance, the prospects of assaulting Volodar from the west look even grimmer than from the east. From the east, the Russians at least managed to get on the hill by moving from McCluskey, which allowed them to assault Ukrainian positions from the same elevation as you might remember. Around a week ago, I told you that the Russians moved to Volnovka dozens of pieces of equipment and a lot of manpower in preparation for a heavy push. And as it turned out, their job would be to penetrate the front line west of Volodar. Unfortunately for the Russians, the recent drone footage showed that the Russians lost 13 battle tanks and 12 infantry fighting vehicles in a single engagement, which means that a fresh Russian tank battalion lost its combat capability in one day. A Ukrainian reserve officer also reported that right now the fights are mostly conducted by ethnic Tatar volunteer battalion instead of Russian Marines. This suggests that the Russian Marines from the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade sustained insurmountable losses and were replaced. This is not surprising considering that the Russians had already lost half of the Marines in this brigade when they stormed Pavlivka. This caused a huge scandal in which all Russian media sources shared a devastating critique of the Russian command demanding to fire the high-ranked officers. The main point of the critique was that Russian vehicles advanced in one line, which made them a perfect target for the Ukrainian artillery. However, even though there are many ways to solve this region, all of them are bad. These fields stretch for almost 10 kilometers and they have been densely mined by the Ukrainians, which means that the probability that a vehicle runs into anti-tank mine is almost 100%. In order to make sure that they make a deep penetration despite the mines, they were ordered to move in a column, betting that the Ukrainians discovered them too late. However, the Ukrainians discovered them on time and destroyed them with their artillery. The total Russian defeat in Boulder has ruined the upcoming massive offensive operation. Judging by the number of forces devoted to this region and judging by the fact that the Russians engaged a lot of tanks in each of their attacks, it is clear that they intended to take Volodya and not just conduct combat reconnaissance to fix Ukrainian troops. The Russians needed to create a sudden breakthrough here because the battle for Bakhmut has been going on for so long that the Ukrainians have adjusted. so the fall of Bakhmut is unlikely to change the global setting. On the other hand, the fall of Volodar would require rapid deployment of strategic reserves in an attempt to stop the penetration. But the breakthrough did not happen. The Russians suffered extensive losses, and when they finally launched their offensive in the Luhansk region, their mobilized soldiers will have to deal with fresh Ukrainian troops. This will lead to a much slower pace of advance than planned, which will slow down even more with the return of the rainy season.